Just to start out, make sure the document is large enough. Since this is art for a card, I usually keep it at least 2000 pixels by 2000 pixels at 300 DPI minimum. I'm going to go over some stuff that could be fairly obvious for your skill level, but I don't want it to assume anything and would rather be thorough. The pen doesn't matter so much for the initial sketch, but keep in mind I use a very strict set of pens / brushes for the actual drawing. A quick note, kind of ignore the pens on the left-hand side. I will be giving you a brush pack that has all the correct ones named. You can also skip ahead a bit once this initial sketch is done. This is just guesswork. I kind of just am feeling out the piece, what I feel would kind of look good in the space. Not too important, the lines anyway. It's also important to do little expressive voices like doot, woo. Just to really accentuate those lines. Woo, wee, zit. Good enough. Okay, so it's also important to make sure that you can still observe the sketch layer, obviously. We want to start a new one, so you can just draw over top of it and just delete it when you're done. Once I am finished with the sketch, I immediately create a new layer for the ink. These lines are done in one stroke and are almost always freehand. Most of the work ends up looking very flat with bold outlines, kind of just the aesthetic. So if you're taking notes or don't have the script for this in front of you, the line work is done in one stroke. It always needs to look hand-drawn, even a little wiggly at times. And line weight can vary with pressure, but needs to stay at a consistent size. Once again, you should be supplied with the appropriate pen tool. It's just named main line and responds to pressure. This pen tool is consistent with every object and character. So all the items in the game, all of the characters all have this consistent kind of outline. It gives us this very flat comic booky feel. And it's important that the lines are all hand-drawn. Even if the line is supposed to be as straight as you can, it's got to have a little bit of character to it. Line weight on the edges of the object need to stay relatively the same thickness / pressure, but inside lines can convey personality and detail, and those can vary much more. So any lines that would be on the edge of the object should be a little bit more consistent and almost act like it was a color by, like a coloring book almost. Except you're doing the coloring too. That's okay. Also remember, the lines must have personality. Every line tells you something about the part of the object. So in this case, the object is made out of paper, so it has plenty of little creases and folds. The object itself is origami, so We know that paper origami is folded by hand, so the creases should be a little sloppy, and the lines should be much straighter if this was made out of metal or plastic. So every single one of these lines drawn are indicating that there's some clumsy old fingers that are folding this paper up just to give it a little bit more character. I usually assume that collectively all of the strokes together look okay, so I don't tend to redraw a ton of lines unless it's really important, if that line itself is really important for indicating what the object is. I think it's okay in this case. I'm just kind of winging it a bit. I probably should have picked a better object than a piece of paper as the entire object, but I don't think this is a terrible tutorial image, actually, because we'll get into that. I mean, look at that. There's a lot of like little creases that make this unique. You need to think really granularly. So every object has a texture, a feel. Every line informs collectively what something is made out of. And that, pertains to how it was made too. I think it's really important to think of like how the objects are made. Also, unrelated, this isn't what the origami lanterns look like at all. The folds are wrong. If you try and assemble one yourself, you'll see what I mean. But 99.9% of people will not have any idea what I'm talking about when they're looking at the final piece. Unless you know origami. But I guess also good practice, make sure to hit the mirror button to mirror the image every once in a while. I can definitely improve this corner a bit down on the bottom right, and I'll fix that later. I'm fighting every instinct to sound like Bob Ross. It's like, that line looks great, but you can do it however you want. As long as it is consistent with the aesthetic. Dude. That's looking pretty done to me. Yeah, hit that mirror. Because look at that corner. I know the aesthetic should be the images tend to be a little flat, but not that flat. I feel like most of the time I could also just redraw that corner, but we're still going kind of fast and loose. Maybe in another tutorial I'll make more mistakes so you can see how I fix them. Because you don't gotta tell me how sloppy this is. So all the original cards were drawn by hand with a 3 to 5 millimeter micron felt tip pen. So I like to keep consistent with that. So all these cards should feel you know, like they were drawn on actual paper. So coloring the object should be fairly straightforward as well. There's only one color palette I pull from, and I use it in the subview section on the right hand side. That's it. I usually just mix the colors together if I'm trying to get something else. The color palette for PotionSlingers should stay consistent with this ugly looking palette. I will supply that as well. It should be in the tools with the brushes and pen sets. So make sure you color in separate layers. In order to make things easy, I just use the paint bucket tool and then add brush strokes afterward. And if you can think of any ways to shortcut my process, please feel free to message me about it. This is just how I do it now. I'd also suggest changing the background to a light gray or transparent so it's easier to see while you work. That's not what I did because I forgot, but usually with color it's a lot better. It's better practice. So to explain what I did really briefly, in order to quickly fill in the empty space, you set the ink layer as the reference layer. It's that little lighthouse looking symbol down near the layers. So you set the ink layer as the reference layer, then make sure the fill tool is set to refer to other layers and applies to connected pixels only. Refer multiple must be checked, low tolerance. If there are any gaps after filling in, switch the paint bucket setting to paint unfilled area. To paint individual sections, use the wand tool when you want to get more specific without changing the brush size. And make sure you stick to one direction for a light source. In this case, it's shining on the top and face. So those spots will get hit by the most light. That's usually where I tend to do it for these item cards, but obviously context will change that. To start blending in the initial paint strokes, set the brush to main brush gouache. Most of the objects have this gouache oil paint quality to it. Paint with actual brush strokes in most cases. You don't have to hide the brush strokes, but you should also make the ends of the brush strokes look somewhat like they are painted on if possible. And you'll see me get a little lazy like on the left hand side on some of the fill-in strokes, but I plan on blending in some more colors like this light blue here. So right here, help give the edges of the object some weight by applying different colors and values. Note how I'm using blues to make the paper have a slightly cooler feel to it, and I might hit the top with some warm reds and yellows to try and imply it's hit by a bit more light. I very rarely use white other than some highlights, even though this could be made from printer paper, this origami piece here. I still use that warm yellowy beige. Yeah, nothing too crazy. It's okay if some of the color bleeds through the lines a little bit. It really is trying to emphasize this kind of hand-drawn but not totally sketchy quality to it. Just trying to fill in some of these little cracks and creases where the light gets sucked in. And then really defining the edges of the paper. There you go, and just hit that with a little bit of a highlight. So now I'm using the texture tool to try and slap it on there. Once the gouache is down in a satisfying enough way, I'm trying to make it more papery now. So the texture brush is supposed to mimic a sponge. I want the paper to have texture to it. Always feel free to use this brush to add a little grime or rust to everything to give it varying degrees of I found it in a junkyard kind of feel. Every character has a little bit of dirt on them too. So this is the number 2 brush. Once the little gouache paint strokes are painted down, it's time to give some some chunk to it. I mean, I'm not sure people shower as often in this world, even after traversing through sand, dirt, and tomb. And once again, it's important to maintain the colors from the color palette and not stray too far to make sure that it keeps this kind of same flat, cohesive look. It's really important that the color palette holistically matches all the other pieces. There's a couple times where I'll break that rule, usually when I'm trying to reference something else that needs a very specific color. There's a bottle that's supposed to be painted the color of mummy brown, so it's a very, very important color. And there's like one where that mimics the original Super Soaker color palette, so I tried to match that as much as possible, but those are very rare breaks. And feel free to experiment with some different splashes of color here and there. I think it's nice to make the paper a little bit more than just paper. Everything's got this kind of rainbowy, dirty, grungy sheen to it, if that makes sense. I'm using this card template as well, really quick and dirty, just to make sure the image fits okay in the frame. We can both do it better than how I'm doing it here, so don't tell anyone that I'm just kind of like, I mean, that's just quick and dirty. Basically, it is time to do the background, though. We're done with the little piece itself, but with backgrounds, two things are pretty important for this card in particular. It needs to match other vessels, and their backgrounds are color-coded to the quality of the vessel. In this case, cold and wet color palettes in vertical streaks. Again, the way you would work with a character might be slightly different, considering it's not exactly a background, but if you're doing backgrounds, it'll... I lost my train of thought, but whatever. Anyway, specifically with these backgrounds, I'm going to be working in some light blues, greens, some lavender, letting a little bit of white show through, etc. It's contextual. The reason why I'm doing these kind of streaks in this direction are that it helps codify that this is a vessel. Rings have their own separate backgrounds. They're a little more swirly. Every single one of these has their own kind of codified language to them. I'm using this brush just to let the background kind of taste the colors. And then I'm going to use the gouache brush to help blend the colors together. It's okay that it isn't perfect for now. Item cards are the only time backgrounds are more abstract. And I typically like backgrounds for the character cards to be a bit visually busy, and then knocking it back with a noise filter. I feel like if you're making a background for a game, it should feel lived in, and being lived in should be really cluttered and busy. But also, Earthbound and the Mother series look great, so what do I know? Nothing too fancy. I feel like if you overwork it, you lose a lot of the colors you threw in there in the first place. So now I'm just going through the filter and I'm giving the background a watery wiggle just to match the other water or cold and wet backgrounds. But after that, it's pretty much done. Only thing that's left after adding that is to knock the background back with a noise filter. That filter is super important. You just file, insert, pattern as image, supplied noise filter. That's done as a in Clip Studio Paint. So I don't know exactly what else you might be using. Usually when I'm adding the filter too, I zoom in a bit to make it a little bit chunkier and more pixely, but after that the item is done. Yeah, there we go. More. Okay, good enough. Characters follow the same rules as the items, they just have a lot more moving parts. But in short, maintain your layers, give your lines intent and make them hand-drawn. Stay painterly, colorful, and on palette. Add grit and grime and a light source. And knock the background back with a noise filter. I should probably be making more examples and better examples that aren't just one object with one texture. Maybe something a little bit more playful, made out of multiple objects, or even a character. But for now, this should give you a pretty good idea of the aesthetic of PotionSlingers. Thank you for watching.